This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Elena Guzman, who teaches in the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Indiana University. In addition to her critical writing and research in anthropology, which includes a book manuscript entitled Chimera Geographies, Spiritual Borderlands of the Afro-Caribbean, she is a filmmaker whose creative work explores, quote, the transcendental and spiritual experience of African diasporic religion and spirituality, in addition to its intersections with race, gender, and mental health. In this conversation, we discuss the expansive possibilities of transdisciplinary thinking, the role of a Black studies sensibility in anthropological research, and the place of creative work in the institutional life of Black studies. Hello, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. It's good to have a chance to talk to you today. How are you?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Really happy that we have a chance to talk. I think your work and your place in the field is really interesting. I mean, we'll have a chance to talk about it or hear you talk about it, of course, as we go along. But think about your work in anthropology, but also as an artist and your position in Black studies. I'm just really excited to have somebody who's working between so many approaches, between social science and art and history and theory. So I really appreciate you making the time, and I'm looking forward to this today.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you inviting me on here, and I'm excited to talk about all of the work that I do. Sometimes I joke that I have like 10 jobs in trying to juggle all of these different roles, but you know, it's also like what keeps me going. So I'm excited to dig into it.
I will say one way I would describe Black studies as a field is it's a field of study where people do have multiple jobs, right?
You kind of have to.
Absolutely. Well, before we get into sort of how you imagine Black studies, how you think about your work in relation to it, I wanted to start with maybe a more personal question and just ask you to narrate us along, how did you get interested in the study of Black life? What motivated you? What drew you to Black studies? And just as importantly, what sustains your work in that? Because your work is it's book writing, it's also art making, and so something's sustaining you in this relationship. So, what motivated you? What sustains you?
Yeah, I think in so many ways, my interest in Black studies and the work that I do really started off. I would say maybe even thinking about kind of in a nonlinear way. My work is so influenced by my ancestors and spirit guides. And so when I look back at my journey into academia and Black studies, I see so strongly how it was very much, I was being led on a path to the work that I'm doing in Black religion and Black visual arts and creativity. And I didn't know it at that time that I was being led on this path. But I think that I look back and say it's so obvious because all of the tools that I have now to be the kind of scholar that I want to be, I built them very slowly along this path that I was unknowingly going on. And so I started really my journey in undergraduate. I was at Hunter College in New York City, and I was, I remember kind of coming into college, first gen college student. I didn't know anything about academia. I didn't know that it could be a career, but I was so excited about the possibility. I think I came in as like a psychology pre-minor or something, pre-major or something. So I was super interested.
I have to say, so many people, it's like psychology or economics. I also was a psychology, quote unquote, major coming in. So, anyway.
Right. I think it's the ideal is just like the fascination with the study of just like these really really like psychological, philosophical things. And I think that's really where it started. But I was also so fascinated with, I was taking sociology classes, I was taking philosophy, I was taking all of these different courses. And so it wasn't really until at a certain point where I was forced to declare my major that I was like, I guess I'm going to do anthropology, right? But I wanted to do everything. Like I just was like taking literature, I was taking all of these things. And I think that in so many ways, that beginning of just being so excited by everything that was happening around me and wanting to learn was the foundation of who I am, I think, as a Black Studies scholar, because I was really learning about the foundations of so many humanities and social sciences that really became foundational to who I am today. And I think anthropology, the reason why I had that I had just decided to go with anthropology at that time was that all of the professors that I was really interested in working with, they were anthropology professors who worked in Black Studies departments. And that was something that became like a kind of line, a thorough line, actually, through a lot of my work or a lot of my training in general. And so I was majoring in anthropology, but I was minoring in Africana, Puerto Rican, Latino studies at Hunter College. And so for me, anthropology and Black studies were so interconnected in the way that I didn't realize that when I went to graduate school that it wasn't going to be like that. I was very shocked when I went to grad school and it was like, wait, Black studies and activism isn't like a core part of anthropology? This is very strange to me. And I think in a lot of ways since then, I've been attempting to reconcile that and wanting to stay true to that foundation because it existed, right? And it continues to exist. And so how do I continue to stay true to that, where I see anthropology as a kind of methodological foundation, but for me, Black studies is the foundation of all of the work that I do as a scholar artist as well, in terms of theory and method, et cetera. And so I don't see really a disconnection between the two in the way that other people might, even though anthropology is this very disciplinary field that has a very, distinct history, in many ways opposite history of Black studies and being a kind of enterprise of colonialism. But to me, I didn't know that about anthropology when I first started it. And so in a lot of ways, I've been attempting to kind of reconcile or really just claim in a very profound way the connections between anthropology and Black studies that to me are so interconnected. And so that's a lot of what keeps me going in my work is really finding those spaces and those communities and people who are doing that work that is based in community work, that's based in activism, that is based in art. That is the foundation of all of the work that I do. And so in many ways, I think it's trying to navigate the university system as it attempts to discipline me. It attempts to put me in a box, right? And I know that I don't fit in any of those boxes because of how wide my interests are in general. And so for me, I think I always see Black studies as the foundation of all the interdisciplinary work that I do. Black feminist thought in particular is really critical to the work that I do as well. And so in a lot of ways, that's really what started my journey. And then also, I think in a lot of ways too, I always tell people like my own research has always been this kind of profound attempt to understand my own life and history, that of my ancestors and thereafter. And so I think for me, that is what keeps me going, actually, is what keeps me. I want to kind of understand these things in such profound ways, these lived experiences. I want to understand them more. And so that is the question that continues to keep me going. It's not just about me. It's about community. It's about ancestors. It's about so much more than me, actually. And so when I am in 3-hour faculty meetings, that's what keeps me going.
I mean, that's about to have one on Wednesday. So give a trigger warning before you say 3-hour faculty meeting. But no, the question of sustenance, I mean, I asked that for a reason, because I do think, thinking about it that way, that we have to have something that sustains us, because we don't just play. It is a job. It is a grind. It takes discipline and regret and loss of hope and energy and motivation and all of those things. And it's really interesting to me to sort of think about how you were talking about undergraduate as this sort of moment of really giving you some roots in the plural, because, you listed anthropology, Latino, Puerto Rican studies, Black studies, and then coming to a discipline in anthropology and that sort of moment of, I don't know if alienation is the right word,
Oh
but
yeah, definitely.
sort of alienation from those roots, but then the activity that it takes to maintain them and come back to them. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, that is absolutely what keeps me going is the ability that to be able to continue to do these creative, activists, community-based work. Because I always tell people I want to make work that is intellectually rigorous, and I also want to make work that my family can read or watch or understand. I think there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
jokes amongst like first generation college students of like, my family has no idea what I'm doing, right? And I think
Mm-hmm.
that is really telling of just kind of how how separated we can kind of become from just kind of everyday life in a lot of ways. And so for me, I'm always trying to ground myself in that reality. Is
Mm-hmm.
my artistic scholarship is very much about reaching communities in a different way, and my written scholarship is about reaching a different kind of community, right? All are valid and all are important in different ways.
So that leads to this next question, and maybe you've in some ways already answered it, but maybe I would love to hear more thoughts on it, which is how you imagine the field of Black Studies. That Black Studies has it's 50 something years old at this point, and it really has such an interesting tension at its origin. Like, one is this need to and demand that Black intellectual traditions, Black life be studied in literary, historical, philosophical, sociological, etc. contexts, right, at the university, that documenting of Black life is an imperative and a demand. But it also came at a time, right, where the post-civil rights Black liberation struggle had become really militant about connections between community and wherever else you were, right? That Black liberation struggle in Black communities had a deep connection to this struggle to represent Black life on campuses and in curricula and so forth. So one is really driven by, this is oversimplifying, but an intellectual imperative, and the other by a political demand for liberation. So I'm curious how it's 2024, so we're 54, 55 years out from the origin story of Black studies. How do you imagine the field now in relation to this tension that lies at its origin?
Yeah, I think it's such a fascinating question that I think a lot of scholars in Black studies are contending with in very like personal academic ways. The tension of Black studies being born out of liberation struggles, and then what then happens when Black studies and that liberation and practice and intellectual tradition then becomes institutionalized. And then we're up against the forces of the institution. I think that's one of the difficulties for sure of Black studies that continues to be an ongoing issue for sure. Like, how do we recognize Black studies as a discipline with its own history and methodology, while also allowing for it to be an interdisciplinary, multi-methodological field? And I think that's where a lot of the tension really comes up, is how to bridge those spaces of allowing for the innovation that comes with transdisciplinarity, which I think is really core to Black studies, but at the same time also recognizing the history and the foundations of Black studies.
Yeah.
And so this tension is something that I think a lot of scholars deal with, specifically those like myself who were not directly trained in Black studies, but have Black studies as a foundation within their work, is how then do we kind of embrace this interdisciplinarity while also recognizing the foundations and how critical Black studies is as a discipline itself. And I think that contradiction is something that I feel like I, in many different ways, really attempt to grapple with through my work, and just how I navigate the academy. I see that Black studies in the academy is so important, but I think also Black studies outside of academia is just as important as well. So embracing these, how do we embrace this? And I think this is honestly just a reality that I've had to face where, the work that I'm doing has foundations within Black studies and art and activism. This is nothing new to Black studies. But because of the institutionalization of Black studies, now we kind of have these frank conversations where how will film and this other creative activity that I'm doing, how will that actually be considered within tenure and promotion, right? And this is just the reality. So Black studies, like, we want to keep doing this work that exists outside of the academy, but then how then does it become appreciated within the academy, right? So how do we hold this balance when you're worried about meetings and committees, but then you also are wanting to make sure that you're staying true to the foundations of Black studies? So for me, I think Black studies is really, its foundation has always been about intellectual rigor and activism, and those are inseparable. The tension then becomes when the institution or others try to separate those two. How then do we contend with that? And I think that's probably one of the biggest difficulties that scholars are dealing with, especially scholar activists, artists, people who are working outside of the academy.
Yeah, I mean, I think about, lots of, it's a really interesting, response. And among the many things you said that stuck out for me is the institutionalization, and then, like, how does work come to be appreciated? Because part of institutionalization is often taking something that's, massively expansive. And then, in the institutionalization moment, that constriction about, this is like blunt and one-dimensional or whatever, but about tenure, right? It's like, what goes in that tenure file? I mean, I think, like, if you're talking about making a film, used to be you could actually drop, if you think about an actual manila folder, you drop a CD in there or a DVD in there, but is that even where we are? Like, where does this go? How does this represent in an institutional context? While at the same time, I mean, the part of it being a transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, antidisciplinary, however we characterize it, field of study, is our materials for teaching and research are these, both ephemera and, lasting, but essay, non-book materials, whether it's, Usman Samban's film or films and, Lorna Simpson's photography. But then when we're actually doing it, right, it's at that moment where that institutionalization closes off some of these moments or threatens to.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had conversation with, mentors who have very just frankly told me that I'm going to have to write the book. As much as I want to do all the creative stuff, people are not going to take me seriously unless I write the book. And that's not a problem because I do writing and I do artistic work. But that kind of goes back to what I was saying about being like someone who juggles multiple jobs. Like, filmmaking is very difficult. I think people underestimate it as a kind of scholarly enterprise and how much work it takes. And so, in attempting to try to make an equivalence between what we know to be products of academia, like an article or a book manuscript, people will be like, okay, so what, a short film, is that like an article or something? And it's like, there's no way to compare the two. And so that's where we start coming into issues, is that we're creating this work, but there's actually no way to actually embrace it and actually identify within the current rules, right? That are currently set up.
And that's the disciplining that's at the heart of that word, discipline, right?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I think the disciplining, and then that goes back to the tension too, right? It's like, we do want to recognize Black studies as a discipline, but we don't want the disciplining that comes with Black studies. Or that comes with the institutionalization of Black studies. So then how do we navigate that? I think that's a difficult question for sure.
Keeping the system open even as it tries to close. I mean, that's a Herculean effort, to put it lightly. But at the same time, as I was saying, I mean, look, Burnett's Killer of Sheep is like Black Studies canon, and no one is saying, gee, is that the equivalent of like writing Invisible Man, right? It's just understood that this is a different way of intervening in a really important way in the conversation about the meaning of Black life.
Yes.
But then when we do it as scholars, I don't do it, but when you do it as a scholar, it becomes a question when it's not a question on a syllabus. For me, that really, I don't know if it's a paradox, a contradiction, but it's an infuriating moment of institutionalization, because it almost like it's a disrespecting of our sources. Right?
Exactly. Disrespecting of our sources, of our foundation, of the ancestors. It's just disrespecting on so many levels. So how could we maintain that level of respect for all of these things while still being able to do the intellectual work that we want to do as well?
They should put us in charge. That's, I think, the only.
I don't know.
Yeah, talk about 3-hour meetings. So yeah, maybe that's
Right,
more of a
exactly.
figure of speech. Well, let me ask then about your work. Your work's invested in you talked about anthropology, ethnographic study, decolonial methods in both your writing approach, but also in your art making, right? So you're also a creative, and for me, that's just like generates so much potential for the study of Black life and actuality. I mean, you've also done work, so. But I'm interested in hearing you reflect a little bit on how your work in that intersection relates to the past of Black studies, critically or complementary, and how you think it might open new horizons in the field.
Yeah. It was interesting. I had a moment this morning where I was just scrolling, reading articles, and I came upon Sonia Sanchez. And there was something about that moment.
This is one of
coming
my
upon-
actual heroes, so I'm really excited about this.
Yes.
I love Sonia Sanchez so much. Okay.
I was reading the article, and I saw it as kind of an affirmation, as a sign in a lot of ways about kind of the way, thinking about this interview here, right? About the way that I think of Black studies and its foundations, and really what the core is of Black studies. And so for me, I see, and it reminded me that, Black feminist community creative work has always been the foundation of Black studies. And so it reminded me in a lot of ways to keep doing the work that I'm doing. And so for me, people like Sonia Sanchez are really important kind of people who have done this work and continue to allow me, myself, to inspire. When I think that there's no place for the work that I'm doing, I know that there is in a lot of ways. And, she went to Hunter College too. So I was just like, okay, there's a connection here that I'm being offered here. And so, one of my, I would say one of the people that I is really important to me within the field of Black studies is Zora Neale Hurston, because similarly for Zora, her work in anthropology and Black folklore and culture were inextricably connected. There was no separating these. And so for me, I see Zora as this kind of icon in which I look up to, in the kind of work that she was doing, not only in Black religion or transnational Black religion, but also transdisciplinary work across different disciplines. She was really pushing the boundaries in a lot of ways. She was making film in the 1930s. She has fieldwork footage that is showcasing Black life in really profound and beautiful ways. And she's writing literature and poetry and short stories, and she's doing anthropological studies. And so for me, that I think she's an important person for me in kind of understanding the work that I'm doing, or thinking about the blueprint that has been left by previous people who have done really important work. And, especially if you think about Zora, she was someone that wasn't very appreciated within her time. And so it's kind of like, how do we prevent that from happening again, right? For the people who are doing that kind of work that is transdisciplinary, non-disciplinary, however we want to define it. I think that for me, Zora represents the foundations of what I understand to be the core part of Black studies, which is like unruliness, right? Even amongst its institutionalization, right? Zora didn't want to follow any rules. And so for me, I kind of think about like, how can I do that while also understanding the importance of like Black studies as an institution or within the institution? Because the reality is without Black studies, right? Institutions, whether they know it or not, because they act like they don't know it, but whether they know it or not is really foundational to everyone's education, but also to all of the other departments as well, and understanding and bringing Black life and liberation to the forefront. So that for me is something that I feel like is an important lesson that Zora has taught me, is to remain unruly, and then also to really just follow where your kind of heart and scholarly mind take you, even when other people totally don't understand it or are telling you, just focus on one thing, you'll be okay, you know? So, Zora is, of course, just one, but there are so many other Black feminist scholars who have done this kind of work that bridge the gap between the creative and the scholarly work. So for me, those are kind of like, I create this kind of mental blueprint of those are the people that inspire the work that I do.
And it's interesting hearing you talk about that because you are talking about foundational figures. I mean, in the case of Hurston, an absolutely foundational African-American intellectual tradition figure. You can't get much more important than Hurston. And with Sanchez, somebody who actually was at the founding of Black Studies at San Francisco State. And just as a side note, my office when I taught at Amherst College was her, because she was an Amherst College professor, was actually her dining room. Formerly her dining room. She came by my office one time, just appeared at my door, and she's one of my favorite writers ever. And I was like, look, this seems very strange that Sonia Sanchez just walked in. She goes, this used to be my dining room. And I was like,
I'm honored.
Amazing. I was like, Professor Sanchez. It's just like completely discombobulated for a million reasons. But as much as, Sanchez and Hurston, just to take the two examples you had, as foundational as they are to the history of Black studies, certainly the Black intellectual tradition with Hurston, I think Sonia Sanchez is way underappreciated, but is really is one of the originators of the field. What they actually did, I think, still pushes a boundary that the field doesn't push very often. So it's interesting hearing you talk about what you're trying to, in the previous, response or previous thoughts you had about, how does my creative work relate to scholarship in the institution of this? Here are people who are at the foundations of the field, and even their work would have that same dilemma here 50-something years later. It's actually kind of stunning.
Yeah, I think it's a little sad too, because there are
it ought to jolt our conscience as a field, I have to say.
Absolutely. I agree. And I also understand that, there's a lot of institutional kind of barriers that prevent this from happening, and people are trying to navigate them as best as possible. So it's by no means, I know there are a lot of people who are trying to make it happen, but still the fact that we are still here and people are telling me nobody's going to take you seriously unless you write a book, I think that is pretty telling of still where we are and how much we haven't progressed in that sense.
It's a good question. Could Zora Neale Hurston get tenure in your department? So we should maybe all be asking that.
Oh, that is a great question.
I might bring it to one of these 3-hour meetings. So let me ask about your movement from anthropology to Black studies. You did your PhD in anthropology. And now you work in an African American studies department, right? Which is moving from a discipline. Anthropology I know it has multiple kinds of approaches, but it's a discipline with disciplinary training, as you said, to an area studies field. And so I'm interested in hearing you talk about how that movement between the two, because I assume it continues to be a sort of back and forth in terms of your work and, but also your classroom, how that movement back and forth between the discipline and area studies has impacted your teaching and your approach to intellectual life.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to the work that I teach in anthropology, it's always going to be based in Black feminism. No matter what I'm teaching, whether it be like an intro 101 type of class, I teach classes on autoethnography. These classes for me are always going to be, the foundation is always going to be Black feminism, and Black studies is always going to make an appearance within my syllabi. So for me, like I see like, kind of like I mentioned earlier, these two fields are just like, I can't disconnect them in my brain, you know? I think that what Black studies allows me, though, that anthropology doesn't, is a bit more freedom to pursue these community-based activist kind of artistic projects. You know, at AAADS here at IU, African American African Diaspora Studies here at IU is one of the handful of PhD programs in Black studies in the United States, and it's also one of the oldest ones as well. Not too long ago, we were celebrating our 50-year anniversary, right? And so that goes to tell you how foundational this department, with other ones, have been in the creation of Black studies. And I think that one of the things that really ground me in being in a Black studies department is that, you know, this department has very much a history of Black arts. And so that African American Arts Institute and the Soul Review and the Black Film Center and Archive all have their foundations in Black studies here at Indiana University. And so because of that, my work becomes less people understand it more, right? Or the contradictions that are easily come up in other disciplines where it's like, oh, that's not really anthropology, or you're doing something else, or whatever the case is. I don't necessarily get that in Black studies. And so I'm encouraged to do the artistic work because of the foundations that this department has in Black art and Black creativity. I'm encouraged to do that kind of work, and then also encouraged to do the intellectual work that I want to do as well. So for me, I think it allows me a bit more ability to be kind of unruly, the word of, of the day. It allows me to be a little bit more unruly and do this work because I do, there's a lot about academia that, like many people, I do not enjoy. And part of what keeps me in academia is the fact that I can do this creative work. At the same time, I also do really enjoy the intellectual work that I do as well through writing. And so the ability to do both of those, I think Black Studies allows for that and really encourages it in a way. So for me, that's kind of where I see, or that's kind of how I navigate between Black Studies and anthropology, is kind of like anthropology as that foundation in terms of method. Because if you think about the foundations, or what ethnography is supposed to be, is the study of like life, right? And so if I'm doing anthropology within the African diaspora, then that's the study of Black life. And that there is the foundation of Black studies. So the contradiction to me doesn't quite make sense when Blackness is kind of relegated to the margins or outside of anthropology. So I'm always trying to bring those spaces together as much as possible, so that people in anthropology and other disciplines can see how core Black study is to their own discipline, rather than, people always talk about how, history and philosophy and all these other things are part of Black studies, right? It's an interdisciplinary field. But I think if we should think the opposite of it as well, right? How foundational Black studies is to all these other fields. What would these fields be without Black studies? It would be very, very different, right? So I think that Black studies has so much to offer to all of the disciplines in a way that allows it to really ground itself within the project of Black studies, which is Black life and liberation.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. They're really interesting. And it's, I was wondering how you would talk about that, because what you had said earlier in terms of your movement from Hunter to your PhD program, right, as this moment of alienation, but it's also like that way that your training at Hunter allowed that alienation, or that sort of work of alienation, to actually not do that much. It kind of sounds like less like FM at Indiana is less of a homecoming than it is like you just kind of, shredded up, and took what you wanted, what you needed from anthropology. Like it didn't have a moment of occupation, which I think that's a threat of disciplines when we think of Black studies as trying to negotiate disciplines,
Mhm.
is that then there's a threat of their occupation. I think departments, for example, that are overly historical have that kind of occupation, kind of like historical methods do. But the way you're talking about it is an inversion of that. It's like, what if Black Studies is the insurgency in the disciplines rather than disciplines being the occupiers that we have to negotiate with in Black Studies?
Absolutely, yes. Let's not I don't want to use the word occupy, that's very colonial, but let's see, what does that kind of liberation and that like
Oh, I was
epistemology of
saying Black
liberation.
Studies is the insurgent.
Oh, right, right. So the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
insurgency, right? So, like what does that mean to be insurgents in other fields? I think that's a way more powerful framework than like, oh, this kind of discourse of Black studies being watered down, quote unquote, because of all these different fields that are part of Black studies. Like, no, it's the exact opposite, actually. We're only made stronger in that way.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but I was like, I cannot. I want to make sure I'm the occupies. I work,
Right.
colonialism, post-colonial, decolonial. It's like my whole field of research. It's like, let me not use occupy in a positive way. No, but I think that is a feeling. I think often in multidisciplinary assortments in Black studies that the disciplines have an occupying relation, and how do we
So,
surge against that? Is how departments become like really richly Black studies. But now I'm
absolutely.
opining myself. Um, well, let me ask you this as a speculative question, but maybe also just a kind of adjudication question. What do you think when you think about 50-something years of the field, what do you think Black Studies has done well, but also what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Hmm. I mean, I think the foundation of what Black studies is the study of Black life and experiences and liberation. I think that is what it's done well, and it continues to do well, and it will always do well. That is the foundation of what makes Black studies so powerful. So I think that, you know, Black studies being unruly and Black studies really challenging disciplinary conventions and methodologies and theories, and Black studies also kind of creating its own methodologies and theories. I think all of that has been really critical to what Black studies has done very well. Um, I think it's a little hard to talk about what Black studies hasn't done well without like a very in-depth dive into like the uh alienation and institutionalization of Black studies and how Black studies departments are often on the margins and underfunded and under-resourced, right?
Mm.
It's not necessarily a Black studies problem as much as it is the institutionalization of Black studies and all the issues that come with that. But I think, I think in terms of what Black studies can do better is as maybe perhaps navigating this tension in terms of the kinds of work and spaces that we are entering. I recently went to a Black Arts Fair in Indianapolis, and it was this Black Arts Fair that was created specifically to highlight Black Midwest artists, but also at the same time to have the community involved within art spaces that they are normally excluded from. And so when I went to the opening event, it was so beautiful because it was just this room filled with people, mostly Black folks from like all different parts of life who were just loving and embracing the art that was there, and they were talking to each other, they were in conversation, they were laughing. It was just like this space that was full of life and art at the same
Mm-hmm.
time. And so I was kind of, when I was there in that moment, I was kind of comparing it to when I go to a museum, right? And it's the exact opposite, right? Where not only is it like an empty space that a lot of people don't have access to or don't even know that they necessarily have access to, it's quiet and it's very rare to see people of color more broadly within these spaces. I was thinking like, okay, to me, this is like a perfect metaphor of what institutionalization of something that's so radical looks like versus when it actually is based in the community. What I would love to see is more of that community-based work that is, what does it look like to have reading groups that are not just based in the academy, right? That are outside, that are in bookstores, that are with community members. What does it look for us to like, to be able to exchange knowledge outside of the academy? What does it look like for us to create art and other kinds of work that doesn't just exist in a journal that people have to pay to even access, right? So for me, I think the challenge of Black Studies is going to be embracing what it already is actually amidst kind of the institutionalization and knowing all the challenges that come with that. But for me, that's what I see. That's the kind of utopian vision of Black Studies in my mind, is kind of that Black Studies both inside and outside of the academy as well, and what that looks like.
Yeah, and how we do that, how we do that both responsibly and in ways that are exciting and challenging and fun. I mean, I think to be intra podcast about it, I did when it came out a couple weeks or a week and a half ago with Austin Lee, who's a postdoc, sociologist, postdoc at BU, and she was talking about this. You walk outside and you can, on the street corner, there's Hebrew Israelites. They've got pamphlets telling you about this and that. Mm-hmm. Where are our she's talking about as a writer and researchers, but also as a Black Studies person. It's like where are our pamphlets? Where are our pamphlets? Or in one that's going to come out in another week or two with Mark Anthony Neal, and he was talking about growing up in New York City and seeing in Uptown to be a table out with all these books, and the books could be any kind of range of things, and it's like Black Studies was on the corner, right? But like, where are we as scholars? Like, where are our ideas? Where are they in unruly places? Because as you said, the way people are relating, the difference between the gallery and the art, the art celebration or festival, I forget which word you used, in Indianapolis. Like, those differences matter, but how we find our way there without being patronizing.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
So
that's key.
Part of doctoral training is almost like building patronizing tone into our marrow, and so decolonizing that way is essential.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in a lot of ways, as a junior scholar, I've had to really unlearn the ways that I was taught to write, and really go back to the ways that I was always comfortable writing, in terms of like poetry and writing in incomplete thoughts and sentences, right? This is stuff that's not necessarily allowable within an academic setting. So, I think the unknowable and the, I don't know, I guess like our question it be that we are trying to make the unknowable known. It is that we're simply just navigating all of these kinds of knowledges and experiences and attempting to understand them, right? But there's no way to fully know. And I think that's something that's really central to Black Studies that is important in its method, right? It's just like embracing that which is unknown, because there is so much which we cannot recover, right? And so how then do we embrace the unknown? And also these different kinds of ways of knowing and being that aren't necessarily considered acceptable forms of methodology. So, for example, if I have a writing piece that is fully based off of divination or something that I did, getting that published in a peer-reviewed journal is probably going to be difficult. Not to say that there isn't a place for something like that, because I think there are a lot of amazing scholars who are doing that work and pushing the boundaries of academic publishing and academic class and education, all of these things, right? But it's still very difficult, right? We're still creating this road, this path, right, for other people to follow as well.
And 50-something years is not a small amount of time to pass. So it's actually, I think it's worth like sitting with that. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, this road is still being plowed, cleared, whatever the right word is, forged. But it's been a long time. We're not talking about 10 years.
Right, exactly. But also 50 years is also nothing in the scope of time too. So it's kind of like...
That's true.
When you think about it, I think there's so much potential for what Black Studies can do. And I think that's exciting, is the potential of what we already have and how to just emphasize it even more.
I think there's a second history of Black Studies to be told, the difference between the creation of Black Studies departments and then the timeline of the creation of Black Studies institutions, like centers and journals and publishing outlets. And that's a short timeline. actually. Very
Right,
short.
exactly. Yeah. Sounds like you got your next book project.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, sure. Why not pile on a
Let's
series of
add another
things that
one.
I never finish and feel bad about? Well, let me ask, thinking about the future of Black studies, is a question that's really been a hard one for me. I think a lot about, and so I like asking, hear people's thoughts on it, about what we would understand to be the success of Black studies. So this is very futurist, right? Rather than taking our index in the moment, which is so fraught with the elimination of Black studies and the failure of our aspirations. But if we imagine a future in which Black studies is successful, what does that future look like? Because I can see, a couple of paths, so I'll just put them out there. One is that Black studies has corrected one of its origins, right, which has corrected the failure of the disciplines to take Black life seriously, and has succeeded in that correction, right? Insurgency is a word I like, come up with other synonyms or variations. That Black studies has so transformed disciplines that we actually don't need Black studies as a field, as a department, as a orientation. The other is the success of Black studies to be a future in which Black studies has developed such distinctive approaches, right? Whether we want to call those methodologies, critical frames, et cetera, that it actually couldn't be digested by or absorbed into disciplines, so that it really becomes its own thing. In the same way that history can't dissolve into English or English dissolve into sociology. So how do you imagine what would be the ultimate achievement of Black studies, to dissolve itself because it's so transformed the disciplines, or to really become something so distinctive that it becomes very much like a discipline?
I don't necessarily see those as opposites. I wonder if there's a place where both of those can exist. I don't think that Black studies can ever be fully digested where it can just kind of disappear and just everybody understands everything that there is to know. I think Black studies as a discipline will always be needed. And I think that reason is because when we start going to other disciplines, as much as Black studies can transform them, the reality is that disciplines like anthropology, history, right, their foundations are not within the same kind of epistemologies as Black studies, right? And so, Black studies centers a Black worldview in a way that other disciplines don't. And so I think it would be really difficult, because that would probably mean the dismantling of other disciplines in order for them to be able to take in Black studies fully. And I'm okay with that, because I'm very anti-disciplinary in the first place. Let's destroy all disciplinarity. And I think that, Black studies is always going to remain critical, even if there's a future where it's not necessarily a discipline within the academy, but outside of the academy, right? That it itself becomes its kind of disciplinary, theoretical, methodological way to navigate life. So for me, Black studies, I don't see a future where Black studies doesn't exist. And I don't see that as a positive thing necessarily. We kind of have to continue to erase. I think Black studies can do what no other discipline can do. So as much as we want the other disciplines to take in some of that, I don't think it's possible for them to fully take in the worldview in which Black studies presents. So for that reason, I think Black studies, the future of it really is to continue to build on its foundation. So the future is its past, is its present, right? That is what Black studies is. And I think that's the way that we continue to do the work that we do, is understanding that we are all of those things at once.
Yeah, really interesting. And maybe related then, as a final question, thinking about, we share a field, Black studies. Whether institutionalized or deinstitutionalized or para-institutionalized, whatever we are. But what do you think is a question we should all be asking? What do you think is the thing we should all be thinking about?
That feels like a really difficult question. I think that kind of on the same vein of the A lot of the conversation we've been having is how do we can how do we how can we continue to be unruly in the space of ruled institutionalization. I was going to say ruliness, but in the space of institutionalization. And I think that that question is broad enough that it can mean a lot of different things to different scholars and activists and creators. Is how do we embrace that as an ethos, as a praxis, unruliness in our teaching, in our writing, and the scholarship we create? How do we continue to push the boundaries? Because the blueprint that has been left of us has been all of these people who have pushed the boundaries in such profound ways. And so we have to keep asking ourselves, how do we continue to push those boundaries? How do we continue to be a part of this? How do we see ourselves within this blueprint for future Black Studies scholars? So that they can do the work, the true work of Black Studies in liberation as well.
I love that. That's a really fantastic place to wrap up. And it goes to this, some sort of like eco-ethics of, leave the place better than you found it. That's noble work, but also difficult work, because
Absolutely.
institutionalization is no small, that's why I use the term occupation. It's not, I don't use it loosely. It feels like that, but to leave this place better than we found it, and freer and more open. I like that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I was looking forward to this conversation. This has been extremely interesting and really thoughtful. So I appreciate your time, but I really appreciate your thoughtfulness and your seriousness. And I think so much of what you said, people who listen is going to leave with a lot to think about, and that's the whole point here. So
Yes, absolutely.
I'm so grateful for that. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for having me. And of course, I think as we're talking about doing the work of Black Studies, I think through and with this podcast as well, I think it's just profound. And this is the kind of work that we need to keep doing. So I'm really grateful to be able to be here and share my thoughts with other people who are doing this kind of work.
Well, that's for me and Ashley, that's been our aim as we started it. So hopefully it ends up being a decent contribution.
Indeed.
All right. Well, take care and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.